My awkward encounter with an old teacher, lessons learned. I hadn't thought about Mr. Foster in years, but there he was, standing in front of the dairy aisle at nearly midnight, looking as startled to see me as I was to see him. Mr. Foster was my high school history teacher, infamous for his strict demeanor and relentless discipline. He was that teacher, the one everyone quietly feared and respected, even if they didn't always like him. Back then, I hadn't exactly been his favorite, but I'd always admired his passion for teaching, even if he could be a bit intimidating. Now, though, years later, he looked different, older, worn down, his eyes hollowed by shadows, and a twitch of something I couldn't place. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, polite smiles and small talk, though his eyes never quite seemed to meet mine, always darting to something over my shoulder or down to his shoes. He asked about my life, work, if I'd kept in touch with any classmates, his tone almost too casual. I gave vague answers, trying to gauge his mood. Then he began mentioning names of classmates I hadn't thought about in years, names of students who had either clashed with him or whom he'd seemed especially hard on. It was odd, him asking about those specific people, and I felt a twinge of discomfort growing with each question. Then he asked if I'd ever felt like he'd treated us unfairly, like maybe he'd been too strict or harsh, and before I could really answer, he suddenly invited me to grab a coffee, claiming he had something to explain. Curiosity got the better of me, and I reluctantly agreed. We found a 24-hour diner nearby, and the whole way there, he seemed distracted, nervous, almost rehearsing something under his breath. Sitting across from him, I felt the atmosphere shift. He seemed less like the imposing teacher I'd once known and more like a man carrying a heavy weight. He began talking about how, as a teacher, he'd always seen potential in certain students, myself included, and how sometimes he worried he'd let that get to his head. "You were different," he said, his voice low, almost conspiratorial, as though he were confessing a secret he'd held for years. I nodded awkwardly, unsure of what to say. He went on, talking about how his methods may have been unconventional, but how they were necessary. Then his tone shifted, growing darker, more regretful. "There are things," he murmured, his gaze dropping to the table, "things I wish I could undo." He trailed off, his fingers drumming on the table, his face a mask of conflict. My heart started to race as he talked about ethical lines and gray areas, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I didn't want to hear where this was going. I mumbled something about needing to leave soon, but he blocked my way, insisting I stay a little longer, as though he needed me to bear witness to whatever confession he was about to spill. Trapped, I tried to appear calm, nodding along as he spoke, all the while trying to think of a way to leave without setting him off. He leaned in, whispering, "Sometimes, you find yourself doing things you wouldn't normally do, all because you think it's right in the moment." His eyes had this haunted look, his voice wavering as if he were on the edge of a breakdown. I mumbled an excuse, something about needing the restroom, and slipped away as quickly as I could, my hands shaking as I dialed my friend's number, desperate to get out. When I came back, he was sitting there, calmer, eerily so, as if purging his soul had given him peace. He thanked me, his expression almost serene, and he walked out of the diner without another word. I sat there, stunned, trying to process everything, but a part of me didn't want to dwell on it. Later, I learned from an old classmate that Mr. Foster's name had been brought up in a few school scandals, allegations of misconduct that had been quietly swept under the rug, though nothing was ever proven. It was surreal to think that this man, who I'd once respected, had carried secrets so dark, and even more chilling to realize I'd been inches away from a confession that might have changed everything I thought I knew. The memory of that night haunts me still, the uneasy feeling that I barely escaped something truly sinister. I never really understood gratitude until it became a necessity for my survival. It all started when I moved to a small town in the middle of nowhere, far from the bustling city life I was used to. The air was crisper, the nights were darker, and the people were peculiar, to say the least. I didn't have a job lined up, I was just trying to escape the drudgery of my old life, thinking a change of scenery would heal my restless soul. Little did I know I'd find myself entangled in a nightmare that would ultimately teach me the value of gratitude and the power of perspective. My first few weeks went by in a blur, filled with long walks through the forest and attempting to set up my little cottage. It felt peaceful at first, but as days wore on, I began to notice strange occurrences around me. Things would go missing, my favorite mug, my keys, a book I had been reading, only to show up later in odd places like under the bed or in the refrigerator. When I spoke to the neighbors about it, they simply nodded with knowing smiles and said, "You'll get used to it." Used to what? I asked silently. I brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks on me, a byproduct of too much silence and too little human interaction. But then one night, while trying to prepare for bed, I heard whispers coming from outside my window. It sounded like laughter mixed with soft humming, and it sent chills down my spine. I pulled the curtains tight, convincing myself it was the wind or some nocturnal animal. Yet, the strings of uneasy tension in my gut unraveled that night when I closed my eyes. Sleep clutched at my thoughts, but then a dream took me to a familiar place. I was wandering through a dark forest, disoriented and afraid, the whispers echoing around me. They grew louder, pleading, begging. I remember one figure stepping into the moonlight, an older woman with wild hair and deep-set eyes that glimmered with mischief. She smiled, but it was empty, void of any warmth. "You're not grateful," she whispered, her breath ghosting over my skin like a chill. I jolted awake, my heart racing, the room cloaked in darkness. That was when I understood that I couldn't keep living in ungrateful silence. The very next day, I ventured deeper into the woods, hoping to clear my mind and maybe even confront whatever spirit had invaded my dreams. The trees towered above me, branches intertwining like gnarled fingers trying to hold me back. Just when I thought I would turn back, I stumbled upon a clearing with an ancient-looking stone altar at its center. It was covered in moss and surrounded by vibrant flowers that somehow thrived in the shade. It was breathtaking, and I felt a strange compulsion to kneel before it. As I knelt, I summoned all my worries, my fears, and my anger. But from these dark places, gratitude began to blossom. I thought of the coffee I sipped every morning, the warmth of my lined sweater against the chill, the beauty of the forest around me. I uttered quiet thanks for the air in my lungs and the ground beneath me. And as those words escaped my lips, something magical happened. The wind picked up, swirling around me, rustling the leaves and lifting the flowers from their slumber. The whispered laughter returned, now sounding jubilant and harmonious, no longer a source of anxiety, but a celebration of life. I didn't look behind me, but I could feel them, those who had been watching, waiting for me to learn. Day after day, I returned to that sacred clearing. I cultivated gratitude through ritual, each acknowledgement like a seed planted in rich soil. With each visit, the spirits grew closer, their forms shifting in the corners of my vision, always just out of reach. They didn't torment me anymore, they danced along with my thoughts, accepting my offerings of thanks. I began to embrace the wonders of my mundane life. Every small act became an opportunity for gratitude. When I found my missing items, I laughed instead of groaned, thanking the spirits for the reminder to appreciate the little things. I started to forge connections with my neighbors, sharing meals and stories. I realized they weren't strange, they were just alive in a way that was foreign to me. I finally felt like a part of this community, a web of gratitude and understanding. But there was something lurking at the edge of my new perspective. I knew I was being watched, but not in a malicious way. They were waiting for the moment when I would fully understand. On a particularly foggy morning, I dreamt of the old woman again. She stood before me, no longer a sinister figure but a wise sage dressed in flowing robes made of winds and shadows. "You've learned well," she said, her voice soothing my lingering fears. "But there's one more lesson." I followed her design, wading through the fog until we reached an expansive, dark lake shimmering under an ethereal light. "Face the depths," she beckoned. With great trepidation, I approached the water's edge and peered into my reflection. Staring back at me was my fear, all the anger and loneliness I had tried to bury. "You must accept even this," she told me. "Only then will you truly be free." And in that moment, I didn't hesitate. I stepped into the frigid water, feeling it surge around me, enveloping me in its icy grasp. I recognized my past failures, the shadows that had clung to my spirit. And instead of fighting, I surrendered, embracing every struggle, every sorrow. I emerged gasping for air, renewed, the weight of my past no longer dragging me down. The lake, once dark and foreboding, sparkled with hues of gratitude I had never witnessed before. In the days that followed, I felt lighter, filled with a newfound appreciation for everything the world offered. The spirits began to take form more often, no longer mere shadows but shimmering lights, guiding me through the tasks of everyday life. They helped me navigate the complexities of relationships, urged me to speak kind words and dress my thoughts in gratitude. Then, one evening, as I ventured back to the altar for my ritual, the night air filled with warmth and laughter. The community had gathered to celebrate harvest season, their joy infectious. I smiled and joined the festivities, no longer an outsider but a cherished part of the fabric woven into their lives. Gratitude had transformed my darkness into light, my fears into strength. And as the stars twinkled above, I felt the spirits dancing among us, celebrating my journey in ways I could have never imagined. In the end, it was gratitude that saved me, not because the darkness vanished, but because I learned to coexist with it, transforming my fear into appreciation. And every day since then, I find something to be thankful for, knowing that the cadence of life sways in rhythm with the whispers of invisible friends guiding me through the intricate dance of existence. I still walk through the woods, where laughter and whispers weave a tapestry of understanding, gratitude forever etched into my heart, my new normal holding an eerie yet beautiful semblance of what I once feared. I've debated sharing this story because it's still fresh in my mind, an experience that haunts me. It all began on an ordinary Tuesday. I was a junior in college, overwhelmed with finals and the pressures of life. I had always been the kind of person who prided myself on being self-sufficient, stubbornly thinking that asking for help was a sign of weakness. But on that day, everything changed. It was late at night, and the campus library was nearly empty. The clock ticked menacingly toward midnight as I pored over textbooks, trying to cram months of information into my sleep-deprived brain. The fluorescent lights buzzed above, casting a sterile glow that felt increasingly oppressive. I could feel a panic starting to set in, the walls of anxiety closing in on me. It was then that I noticed an older man sitting at a table across the room, engrossed in a thick book. He seemed out of place, a relic from another era, with a wrinkled face and glasses that slipped down his nose as he intently flipped the pages. Something about him caught my attention, but I dismissed it as a fleeting thought. As I struggled to focus, I began to hear whispers emanating from a nearby row of shelves. At first, I thought I was imagining things, a product of my exhaustion. But the whispers grew louder, distinct phrases tumbling into my thoughts. Help me. Please. I can't do this alone. My heart raced, the hairs on my arms standing on end. I glanced over at the man, but he remained unfazed, still absorbed in his book. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to gather my things and get out of that library. But for some reason, I sat frozen, captivated by the whispers. They sounded desperate, filled with fear and longing. A heartbeat drummed steadily in my chest, urging me to listen. Gathering my resolve, I finally stood up, my body shaking slightly. I approached the shelves where the whispers seemed to emanate from, my curiosity outweighing my fear. As I rounded the corner, I spotted a shadowy figure crouched between the shelves, its features indistinct but its eyes wide and shimmering in the dim light. My breath caught in my throat. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure looked up, tears streaming down its face, a frail, almost ghostly girl who couldn't have been more than 15. "Please help me," she murmured, her voice breaking. "I'm trapped. I need someone to pull me out." At that moment, I felt a wave of sympathy wash over me. I knew, as a college student, I was far from equipped to assist a child in distress, but her fear twisted something in my gut. "What do you mean trapped? Where are your parents?" I stammered, scanning the room for anyone else who might be around. "They went away. They left me here. But I can't stay here anymore. The library is not safe." The mention of safety sent a chill down my spine. "You really need to get out of here. Come on," I urged, but as soon as I reached for her, a force stopped me. It felt like an invisible wall, paralyzing my limbs. The girl's expression shifted from panic to something predatory. "You don't understand. I can't leave. They're watching. They won't let me go." I stepped back, my mind racing. Was this girl even real? My instincts screamed to run, but there was a part of me that remembered how I'd suffered through anxiety all alone, convinced I didn't need anyone. "Please, just tell me how to help you." The air thickened around us, my heart hammering despite every rational thought trying to escape. And then the smile gracing her face twisted into something malign. "Help? Is that really what you want?" My mouth went dry. I just want to help you." It felt absurd to utter those words to a being I barely recognized. But it was as if those words unlocked a doorway. The shelves quaked around me, and suddenly, I was drowning in darkness, swallowed whole by the very library I thought was safe. I don't know how much time passed. When I came to, I was lying on the library floor, the distant sound of sirens ringing in my ears. The older man was now standing over me, concern etched across his weathered face. I blinked rapidly, trying to make sense of the disorienting noise. "Are you all right?" he asked, extending a shaky hand to help me up. I grasped it, my body shaking. I saw someone, a girl. She said she was trapped." The man's frown deepened. "You must have fallen asleep. There's no one else here." I looked around frantically. No, she was real, she was right here. I pointed at the shelves, my heart racing as I searched for evidence. But everything was still and silent, as if a curtain had dropped over the scene. "I don't think so, kid. This library has a history, it swallowed many who sought refuge within these walls." My skin prickled at the weight of his words. "What do you mean?" I whispered, suddenly feeling a terrible weight press on my chest. "Students have gone missing for years. Some say they were lured by voices pretending to be help, but they were just tricks of the mind, remnants of anxiety or loneliness." I shook my head, his words hitting too close to home. No, this isn't just in my head. I can't be alone." The older man's expression softened, as if he could see my torment. "That's the thing, son. You're not meant to go through this alone. When you feel the urge to retreat, to hide, that's the moment you need to reach out. Ask for help. This place thrives on isolation." The realization hit me like a freight train. If I had tried to ask for help earlier, perhaps I would have avoided this encounter, or maybe it would have never happened at all. As if to emphasize his words, a cold breeze swept through the library, and for a split second, I thought I saw the girl's shadow flit away, her whisper echoing faintly, "Help me." Then it was gone, and the library felt more hollow than ever. I never returned to that library, and I reached out to friends, becoming uncharacteristically vulnerable, admitting that I needed help. Over time, I learned that asking might feel terrifying, but it was the only way I would remain whole. If you're reading this, don't make the same mistake I did. Reach out before it's too late. Because sometimes, the help you deny yourself can lead you to the darkest corners you never wanted to explore. Just promise me, ask for help before it's too late. I never considered myself a bad communicator, but when my girlfriend Lily ended things, reality hit me harder than a punch to the gut. I thought we had it all figured out, but clearly, something wasn't clicking. It wasn't until she packed her things and walked out the door, leaving me with the stinging words "you just never listen" echoing in my mind, that I realized I had to make an effort to change. I stumbled through the initial days of our breakup, drowning my sorrows in binge-watching shows and lofty delusions of winning her back with grand gestures. But as the shock wore off, a twisted curiosity about my failures crept in. I started obsessively retracing our conversations. Texts, late-night talks, all those moments when I thought I was there for her but apparently wasn't. I noticed a pattern. When she opened up, I responded with platitudes or worse, tried to offer solutions instead of listening. It was as if I heard her but didn't really hear her. One night, deep in my rabbit hole of self-reflection, I came across a forum post on an obscure website, titled "How I Learned to Communicate with the Dead." At first, I dismissed it as another incredible hoax, but my morbid curiosity got the better of me. It described a mystical experience involving a one-of-a-kind seance led by a woman named Agnes, who claimed to connect you not just with the deceased but deeper aspects of yourself. It quickly became my obsession. After hours of searching, I found her old shop tucked away in an alley at the edge of town. I hesitated, an uneasy feeling washing over me as I approached the creaky door. Inside, the dim light flickered ominously, and the air was heavy with incense. Agnes was an elderly woman, with wild white hair and piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. "You're here for answers," she stated, almost like a revelation. I nodded, feeling foolish yet strangely compelled by her presence. As she prepared for the seance, she filled the room with an eerie calmness that lulled my anxiety. The candles flickered more with each moment, and the air thickened, almost buzzing with anticipation. "To communicate better, we need to quiet the noise within you." She instructed me to focus on my breath, to strip away the clutter of my thoughts, emotions, and insecurities. I closed my eyes and tried. It was a strange mix of calming and chaos, the constant chatter of self-doubt warring against her voice like an undefeated champion. When I opened my eyes again, I saw the candles flickering wildly, shadows dancing wildly across the walls. Agnes held my gaze, and that's when I felt it, a rush of memories, voices, and emotions flooding my mind. The spirit, she said, represented all those moments I had swept aside. It wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense, but a manifestation of my regrets. Around midnight, I felt as if I had transcended time, hanging on to every single word whispered from the echoes of past arguments with Lily, her voice ringing crystal clear in my mind. I felt her pain, her frustration at my indifference. I was reliving every moment I had neglected her feelings. The weight of it all hit me like a freight train, and I found myself pleading out loud, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you. Why didn't I see it?" But Agnes simply smiled knowingly, her gaze unwavering. "You can't change the past, but you can learn from it. Open your heart and mind to others." When the séance ended, and I stumbled out of the shop, the world seemed different. Colors were brighter, sounds were sharper. In that disorienting moment, I realized communication wasn't about the words themselves, it was about truly listening and understanding the emotions behind them. The next day, I sent Lily a text, a simple message asking if she would be open to talking. Surprisingly, she replied almost immediately. We agreed to meet at our favorite cafe, a place filled with bittersweet memories. My palms were sweaty as I sat down with my coffee, the aroma filling my senses. When she arrived, we exchanged tentative smiles. I had rehearsed what to say 1,000 times over, but all that planning felt unnecessary now that I was faced with her. I started by apologizing, not just for the breakup, but for the times I hadn't listened. To my amazement, her eyes softened, she shared her perspective on everything, and I listened. It felt as if I was hearing her for the first time. As our conversation flowed, I realized that she was still the same, but I had changed. I asked her to tell me about her day, her feelings, even her dreams, all the things I had pushed aside in the past. For the first time, I focused solely on her words, absorbing the emotions behind them. It was awkward and difficult at times because trusting each other again felt like a fragile dance. But as we talked, I began to understand the nuances of communication, the subtleties of patience and empathy. When our conversation came to an end, I was left in awe of the progress we made in just one meeting. We didn't rush back into a relationship, but we established a foundation of understanding that hadn't been there before. I realized truly listening was just as important as talking. That night, I reflected on the experience, how a séance had shown me the ghosts of my actions. It wasn't the supernatural that had changed me, it was the realization of my shortcomings. Days turned into weeks, and Lily and I started to rebuild our connection slowly. There were still bumps along the way, misunderstandings that popped up from time to time, but now, instead of deflecting or dodging them, we faced each issue head-on. Each conversation built more trust, we laughed together, cried together, and, most importantly, we learned how to communicate. I embraced that vulnerability, and it became natural to probe deeper, ask more questions, and show genuine interest in her feelings. I learned not to see silence as an enemy to fill with chatter, but as an opportunity to reflect or understand. Months passed, and one evening on a back porch, while watching the sun dip below the horizon, I turned to Lily and said, "I'm grateful for everything, even the tough times. They made me better." She smiled at me softly, those eyes sparkling with a knowing light as she replied, "I think we both learned a lot, didn't we?" And in that moment, I understood that communication was an ongoing journey, not a destination. It was about empathy, listening, and really valuing what each partner brought to the relationship. I never did see Agnes again, but her words lingered, a soft reminder of how I learned to communicate better in my relationships without the need for spirits or seance. There's a ghost of sorts in every relationship, it's just up to us to confront them. It all started with the invitation, one of those pieces of paper you receive tucked discreetly into an envelope, the kind you tear open without a second thought. I was thrilled at first. The event was a party hosted by someone I considered to be a friend, a local figure known for his extravagant gatherings. When I told my friends about it, they raised their eyebrows but assured me it would be fine. Their tone had hinted at something I didn't quite grasp, a subtle warning obscured by excitement. As the day approached, I felt a growing unease, a tightening in my stomach I couldn't shake. But I ignored it, buried it beneath visions of fun, laughter, and maybe even potential romance. The night of the party, I dressed up, smoothed my hair, and splashed on some perfume, wiping my hands across my cheeks to hide the sheen of sweat. As I pulled into the driveway of the sprawling, ornate house, my gut churned like a stormy sea, whispering that I shouldn't be there. But I shrugged it off. I was there now, hadn't I? I couldn't just leave. I stepped into the glamorous entryway, the sound of music thumping vibrating through the air. Instantly, I was enveloped by the crowd, people laughing and dancing, their faces illuminated by the sparkling chandeliers overhead. Just as I began to relax, my gut pulled tighter, spitting a warning. Something felt off. Ignoring the pressure, I made my way to the bar for a drink, engaging in light conversation with a few familiar faces, all while trying to dispel that gnawing feeling. After a while, the drinks started to flow freely, laughter echoed against the walls, and hints of drunken flirtation filled the air. But something about my host made me uneasy. He laughed too hard, his smiles too wide, and that glint in his eyes felt predatory. My friends had told me about his reputation, the way he drew people in and made them feel welcome just before twisting the knife. Still, I told myself he was just eccentric. After all, I loved the chaotic energy that painted the room. I turned my back on my instincts once more, circulating among the guests, reminding myself to relax. It was all in my head. But as the night wore on, a sense of dread crept over me like a shadow. People started disappearing into a back room, drawn in like moths to a flame, and every time a new wave burst forth, their expressions were uncharacteristically euphoric, almost violent in their delight. My gut screamed louder, panic bubbling as I cautiously approached the doorway. Inside, the atmosphere pulsated. The host stood at the center, a wicked gleam sparkling in his eyes, as he led the festivities with wild enthusiasm. I watched, horrified, as people danced and cheered, the energy shifting from pure joy to something warped. My heart raced. I turned away, intent on leaving, but then something caught my attention, a woman, lost in the throng, her laughter almost too shrill. She locked eyes with me, her expression one of complete ecstasy that sent chills down my spine. I was frozen to the spot. I felt the world blur around me, the creeping fear replaced by a compulsion to escape. My feet finally moved, rushing toward the door, but something held me back. It was that insistent gnawing in my gut, a warning that I couldn't ignore. Just before stepping outside, I glanced back one last time. And that's when I saw it, a haze of flickering light enveloping the room. The host had raised a glimmering object, some ancient drug or charm. As it caught the light, the crowd seemed drawn to it, hypnotized as though the mere presence of it pulled them into a collective trance. I stumbled backward, adrenaline kicking into overdrive. I finally pushed through the door and tore down the driveway, my heart pounding so hard I could barely breathe, the sound of laughter fading behind me. When I reached my car, I slammed the door shut, shaking all over, the terrifying reality of it all crashing down around me. Why hadn't I listened to my gut? Why did I let the thrill of the party drown out my instincts? As I drove away, my mind raced, images of the party, the dancing, the piercing laughter, and that glimmering object haunting my thoughts. That night, I learned a visceral truth: our intuition speaks in whispers and visions, and it's a fool's errand to ignore it. The world may seem vibrant and inviting, but lurking beneath that surface can be darkness, a darkness you might not escape. Since then, I've learned to honor my instincts, no matter how irrational they may seem. I tell my story, an echo of a warning, in the hope it reaches someone before they face a similar temptation, an invitation that turns wicked. Trust your gut, it knows the truth way before our minds can comprehend it. Because in this world, sometimes, the lights dance too bright, and what seems like fun can turn into a nightmare you can't awaken from. You need to listen. Please, just listen. How I faced my fears during a scary trip. How I faced my fears during a scary trip. I had always been the kind of person who avoided anything remotely terrifying. Heights? Nope. Spiders? Hard pass. And don't even get me started on the dark, I'm still the person who sleeps with a nightlight. So when my friends proposed a camping trip to a supposedly haunted forest that lay deep in the heart of the mountains, my immediate reaction was to back out. But after some serious peer pressure and a little too much pride to admit I was afraid, I reluctantly agreed. I told myself it was just one night, and I could handle one night. Little did I know, that one night would completely change my perception of fear and, in many ways, myself. The drive up to the forest was an experience in itself. As we wound our way up the narrow mountain road, thick trees loomed over us on both sides, creating a canopy so dense it almost felt like nightfall despite it being the day. The sky grew cloudy, and soon rain started to pour, drumming on the car roof as if warning us to turn back. We finally reached the entrance to the trail, and as soon as I stepped out of the car, a chill ran through me. I brushed it off, though, blaming it on the cold rain and the lack of sleep from the restless night before. My friends, meanwhile, seemed totally unfazed as they laughed and joked, their voices echoing in the quiet, eerie forest. Armed with backpacks and flashlights, we started the hike to our campsite, a spot nestled near the edge of a small lake a few miles into the woods. As we walked, the forest seemed to close in around us, every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves causing my heart to pound a little faster. My friends were too busy talking to notice the sounds, but I felt like we were being watched. Maybe it was just my paranoia kicking in, or maybe something really was out there. When we finally reached the campsite, the rain had stopped, and fog began rolling over the lake, adding an even spookier vibe. We set up our tents, gathered firewood, and, as darkness fell, settled around the campfire with mugs of hot chocolate. That's when one of my friends, Kyle, suggested we tell scary stories. I inwardly groaned, knowing this would only make my already fragile nerves worse, but everyone seemed into it, so I went along with it. Kyle kicked things off with a creepy local legend about the forest, a story I wish I had never heard. According to him, years ago, a group of people disappeared in these woods under strange circumstances. They were supposedly part of some cult, performing strange rituals near the lake before they vanished without a trace. Some believe their spirits still wander, looking for new souls to join them. My friends laughed it off, but I couldn't shake the image of shadowy figures lurking in the fog, watching us. By the time we'd all told a story, the fire was dying down, and exhaustion began to creep in. We decided to turn in, each of us retreating to our own tent. As I lay there, trying to ignore the sounds outside, the faint crackle of leaves, the occasional drip of water from the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. My rational side told me it was just the forest settling, animals scurrying around, but my imagination conjured up images of ghostly figures, just like in Kyle's story, standing outside my tent. I lay there in silence, every nerve on edge, until I finally drifted into a restless sleep. But then, in the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a sound. At first, I thought I'd imagined it, but then I heard it again, a low, guttural whisper, just outside my tent. My heart nearly stopped. I lay there, frozen, straining to hear more, when suddenly, a shadow passed across my tent, barely illuminated by the faint moonlight. I wanted to call out to my friends, but fear clamped my throat shut. I was terrified, more terrified than I'd ever been in my life. All my instincts screamed at me to stay still, to wait it out, but something inside me snapped. I couldn't let fear control me any longer, not here, not now. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the cold air hitting me like a slap. I scanned the area, my flashlight casting beams through the thick fog. My friends' tents were silent and still. I was about to call out when I heard it again, that same whisper, low and garbled, seeming to come from the edge of the lake. Against my better judgment, I started walking toward it, each step feeling heavier, like I was wading through water. As I got closer to the lake, the fog thickened, making it hard to see. The whispers grew louder, and now they seemed to be coming from all directions, surrounding me. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw something, a figure standing on the edge of the lake, barely visible through the fog. I froze, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The figure turned, and I saw a face, but it wasn't quite right. The features were blurred, almost shifting, like I was looking at it through rippling water. Then it spoke, or maybe it was just another whisper, but I heard it as clear as day. "Why did you come here?" My heart hammered, and I felt a wave of fear so intense I thought I'd collapse. But something kept me rooted to the spot. "Who are you?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. The figure tilted its head, studying me with eyes that seemed too dark, too empty. "We are the ones who stayed," it said, its voice an echo that seemed to come from within my own mind. I don't know what possessed me to keep talking, maybe desperation or the need to know, but I asked, "What do you want?" The figure's face twisted into something like a smile, though it was more disturbing than comforting. "Company," it whispered. "We're so lonely." Suddenly, there was a movement from behind me, and I spun around, only to see my friends standing there, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. Apparently, they had heard the whispers too and had woken up too. Find me gone. They had followed the sound of my footsteps and were as terrified as I was. In that moment, the spell seemed to break. We turned and ran back to the campsite, not stopping until we were huddled around the dying embers of the fire, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding in our chests. No one said a word, but we all understood. We had seen something that defied explanation, something we couldn't rationalize or laugh off. As the first rays of dawn broke through the trees, we packed up in silence and hiked back to the car, each of us lost in our own thoughts. That drive home was the quietest I'd ever experienced, the memory of that night etched into my mind, too vivid to ignore. I haven't been back to that forest since, and I doubt I ever will. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when I'm alone, I swear I can still hear those whispers, faint and distant, calling me back to that lake, back to the fog, back to the ones who stayed. It was a day like any other when I decided that this was the day I would face my fears. I had spent years being imprisoned by panic attacks, crippling anxiety, and a deep-rooted phobia of the dark. I know that sounds cliché, but the shadows had a life of their own in my mind. They thrived on my doubts and flourished in my fears. I had crafted an elaborate routine to avoid anything that could trigger me. I rarely went out after sunset and always made sure to have my lights on. But on this day, I woke up with a determined fire burning within me, stubbornly refusing to allow the darkness to rule my life any longer. I started simple. I went for a walk in a small park I used to love. The sunlight streamed through the branches, and the chirping of birds filled the air. It was a picturesque scene, and I felt a moment of serenity wash over me, but that only lasted until dusk approached. My heart began to race as shadows crept closer, festering their way into my mind. I fought against it, pushing myself to remain where I was, feeling a strange sense of rebellion against the fear that threatened to swallow me whole. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. "You can do this," I whispered to myself. When I opened my eyes, I saw two kids playing hide and seek. Their laughter echoed like a siren call, urging me to join them, to leave the demons behind, if only for a moment. But as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, those kids vanished back into the safety of their homes, and suddenly, I was alone, surrounded by encroaching darkness. I could feel the panic rising again, but I had committed to this path of confrontation. I pulled out my phone, trying to distract myself by scrolling through social media while the last of the light flickered away. But my phone went dead, the screen blackening as if the darkness had swallowed it. My stomach dropped. Here I was, without light, and with absolutely no sense of direction. At that moment, every ounce of determination I had built up began to crumble away. I tried to find the path back but realized I had wandered further than I had planned. I was about to turn back when I heard a rustling nearby, something snapping off a branch with enough force to send adrenaline prickling down my spine. I froze. Thump. It was closer now. My heart raced, and I could feel the sweat forming on my brow as I turned back towards the sound. There was nothing but darkness, thick, palpable, choking darkness. I cursed myself for being so foolish. I heard the rustling again, louder this time, and my gut instinct was to run, but my feet remained glued to the ground, paralyzed by fear. Then, just when I thought my heart might leap right out of my chest, I saw it, a shape emerging from the bushes. I couldn't breathe, could barely think. My mind raced through every horror story I had ever read, every fantasy flick I had ever seen. But it wasn't some malevolent creature that emerged, rather, it was a small, scruffy dog with wide eyes and a wagging tail. My initial fear began to ebb as I knelt down, realizing this little furball wasn't any danger at all. It came closer, sniffing cautiously before leaning into my touch. I couldn't help but laugh, the sound raspy and hysterical as I ruffled its fur. But as much as I appreciated having a companion, I couldn't stay out there forever. I had to get home before the darkness became too encompassing. I stood up, held the dog's leash, which was conveniently tied around its collar, and decided to walk through the park, keeping the lights of my neighborhood in mind. As we navigated through the twists and turns of the shadows, I found myself unexpectedly calmed by the little creature at my side. The tension in my chest slowly started to loosen, reminding me of another evening spent underneath the stars, an innocent moment when I felt free, unburdened by fears that seemed insurmountable. But suddenly, the tranquility shattered. The moment I turned a corner, the shadows roared back to life, coiling around me like serpents. Panic seized me. My breathing escalated, and I felt that familiar, icy grip tightening around my chest. The dog let out a growl, but oddly, it wasn't directed towards me. I followed its gaze, snapping my head to look where it was fixated. In front of me was a figure cloaked in the darkness, a tall silhouette that stood eerily still. My heart felt as though it was clutching a fistful of ice, and dread seeped into my veins. I could barely comprehend the shape. It was the kind of sight you only see in twisted nightmares, all sharp angles and vague features. But something stopped me in my tracks, some strange intuition urging me to not look away. At that moment, I felt an alien sensation wash over me. It wasn't terror, but curiosity. To my surprise, I stepped forward, invoking the very fear that momentarily paralyzed me. "What do you want?" I shouted, my voice echoing as the dark figure remained silent. To my astonishment, the shadow spoke in a voice drenched in shadows. "I want you to face what you fear most." The words rippled through the air, embracing the tension with a chilling calm. "You want to be free, you want to escape the prison you've built inside your mind. But the first thing you must understand is that fear itself is just a part of you," it continued. Those words stuck to me like a fresh wound. I took a shaky breath and flung my hands open wide. "I won't be afraid anymore," I declared. Silence enveloped us for a heartbeat, before the figure melted into the shadows and whispered softly, "Then you are free." It was as if I'd passed through a storm, the panic evaporated like shadows in sunrise. The little dog barked happily, excited as if it understood my transformation. For the first time, I turned and ran toward the light at the end of the path, every stride echoing through the silence like a triumphant hymn. I felt unshackled, liberated from the tight hold of fear as I sprinted past the trees, all while the shadows faded behind me. I reached home, breathless and exhilarated, slamming the door shut, enveloped in warmth and safety. And there, that little dog, my unexpected companion, looked at me as if to say I was never meant to be alone. I sat on my couch, heart racing, only to realize that I had truly faced my fears and emerged from the other side. The darkness would come again, it always did. But now, I understood, the shadows could never truly consume me, they were just a part of the landscape of my life. From that day on, I never let fear dictate my life again. I found a hidden camera in my Airbnb, owner says it's standard. I had always been a fan of Airbnb, using it for years while traveling for work and pleasure, convinced it offered a more personal and unique experience than traditional hotels. So when I booked a cozy cabin nestled deep in the woods for a weekend getaway, I expected a peaceful retreat away from the bustle of city life. The photos were stunning, with large windows that opened up to breathtaking views of the surrounding trees, and the description promised a fully stocked kitchen and a hot tub under the stars. I arrived just before sunset, excitement bubbling in my chest as I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The place was immaculate, and everything seemed perfect. The smell of fresh wood filled the air, and I immediately felt at home. After settling in, I decided to explore the cabin. As I walked through the cozy living room and the well-equipped kitchen, I couldn't help but feel a sense of tranquility. That was until I noticed something unusual in the corner of the living room. At first, it looked like an inconspicuous smoke detector, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I approached it, peering closer, and my stomach dropped as I recognized the small lens protruding from the device. My heart raced, I was staring at a hidden camera. A flood of panic washed over me as I stumbled back, my mind racing. Had I just unknowingly walked into a surveillance setup? I quickly checked the other rooms in the cabin, and to my horror, I found another camera tucked away behind a potted plant in the bedroom. This wasn't just some fluke, the owner had placed hidden cameras around the cabin to watch guests without their knowledge. Anger surged through me. How could someone invade the privacy of their guests like this? I quickly pulled out my phone and took pictures of the cameras, knowing I needed proof of what I had found. I contemplated leaving immediately, but I also wanted to confront the owner. I sent a message through the Airbnb app, expressing my concerns and asking if there were cameras in the cabin. To my surprise, I received a reply almost instantly. The owner's response was curt, stating that the cameras were there for security purposes and that it was standard practice for them to monitor the property. I felt a wave of disbelief wash over me. Security for what? I didn't sign up to be watched while I tried to enjoy my weekend. I typed a furious reply, demanding to know how they could justify this invasion of privacy. The owner responded quickly again, insisting that I had misunderstood their policies. "It's for your safety, and it's all in the description," they wrote. I scrolled through the listing again, searching for any mention of surveillance cameras. Nothing. I was seething, knowing I couldn't stay here any longer. I decided to gather my belongings and get out. Just as I was packing my things, I received another message from the owner. "Please don't leave, I promise. It's only for safety. If you'd like, I can come over and explain." I paused, contemplating my options. Part of me wanted to get the hell out of there, but another part was curious about what this owner could possibly say to defend such a breach of trust. Against my better judgment, I agreed to wait for him to arrive. I sat on the couch, anxiously glancing at my phone, waiting for the owner to show up. Minutes felt like hours, and just as I was about to call it quits, I heard a knock at the door. I took a deep breath, opened it, and was met by a man in his mid-40s with an apologetic expression. "Hey, I'm sorry about the confusion," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I understand why you're upset. Let's talk." I gestured for him to sit, my heart racing as I braced myself for his explanation. "So, here's the deal," he started, leaning forward as if trying to convince me. "I have these cameras for protection. I've had issues with past guests, things getting stolen, damages. It's just a precaution." I narrowed my eyes, feeling my anger reignite. "But you're watching people in their most vulnerable moments. That's not okay." He raised his hands defensively, trying to calm me down. "I know it sounds bad, but I promise I don't actually watch the footage unless there's a problem. I just keep it there to deter anyone from doing anything stupid." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "And what if someone wants to just relax in peace? You don't think that's a problem?" He sighed, looking frustrated. "Look, it's my property, and I have to protect it. I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable. It's just how things are now." I was furious. This was not how I envisioned my relaxing getaway. "I want a full refund," I demanded, feeling the rage bubble over. He looked taken aback. "That's not really how this works. You agreed to the terms when you booked." "Terms that you failed to mention hidden cameras in the description," I shot back. He opened his mouth to respond, but I cut him off. "No, this isn't happening. I'm leaving. I'll report you to Airbnb for this," I said, my voice trembling with anger. His demeanor shifted. "You wouldn't want to do that. You wouldn't want anyone to see the footage," he said, his tone suddenly threatening. My heart sank as fear seeped into my bones. What was he implying? "What do you mean?" I whispered, my voice shaky. "It's just a precaution, like I said," he replied, his eyes narrowing. "But if you report me, I might have to review that footage. You wouldn't want that, would you?" I felt trapped, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. The thought of him having access to that footage made my stomach churn. "I just want to leave. I didn't sign up for this," I pleaded, trying to keep my voice steady. "You can't just leave. You're in a contract with me," he said, and I could sense the control in his voice. Panic gripped me. I needed a plan. "I'm calling the police," I blurted out, knowing I had to protect myself. I grabbed my phone, but before I could dial, he lunged forward and snatched it from my hand. "You don't want to escalate this," he warned, his eyes darkening. I felt a rush of adrenaline as I realized I was in real danger. I needed to get out of there, and fast. I pushed past him, bolting for the door, but he grabbed my arm, yanking me back. "You're not going anywhere," he growled, and fear shot through me. I twisted away, managing to slip out of his grasp. I ran through the cabin, frantically searching for an escape. I spotted the back door and flung it open, sprinting into the woods. My heart pounded in my chest as I dashed through the trees, branches scratching my arms and legs, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I didn't look back. I could hear him yelling behind me, but I pushed forward, desperate to escape. I stumbled and fell, scraping my palms against the rough ground. I quickly got up and continued to run, not knowing where I was going but needing to put as much distance between us as possible. I finally reached a dirt road, and I could see headlights approaching in the distance. I waved my arms, desperate for help. A car slowed down, and the driver's window rolled down. Are you okay? The woman asked, concern etched on her face. Please, I need help. There's a man at that cabin, he's dangerous, I cried, my voice shaking. She didn't hesitate. Get in, she said, and I jumped into the passenger seat. As we drove away, I could see the cabin receding in the distance, and a wave of relief washed over me. I recounted the whole story to her as we sped away, and she listened, her eyes wide with disbelief. She dropped me off at a nearby gas station, and I immediately called the police to report what had happened. The officers arrived quickly, and I gave them all the details, including the hidden cameras and the threats he made. They promised to investigate and assured me I did the right thing by coming forward. That night, I stayed in a hotel, shaken but grateful to be safe. I couldn't shake the feeling of vulnerability, the realization that I had put myself in a dangerous situation. I reported the owner to Airbnb and waited for their response, feeling a mix of anxiety and relief. A few days later, I received an email from Airbnb, confirming they had removed the listing and were investigating the matter further. I felt a sense of justice as I read their words. The experience had changed me. I would never trust an Airbnb so blindly again. I learned that sometimes, what appears cozy and welcoming can hide something sinister underneath. Now, every time I travel, I make sure to research the listings thoroughly and always trust my instincts. I never want to feel that helpless again, and I know that the world can hold hidden dangers, even in the most unexpected places.